Okay, welcome back. So we're going to start talking a little bit about the sort of structure of the therapy, and we'll see how we go in terms of time. I'm probably going to jump some of the slides so that I can make sure I cover everything I want, but you will have the slides in Spanish, so at your leisure you can read all the bits that I'm going to be skipping over. So when you look at any brief psychological therapy, you will see that its originators tend to conceptualize it in terms of phases, yeah? And this is really generally for the benefit of the therapist rather than for the patient, but it's a way of giving you an internal structure for thinking about where you are, what you're trying to do, what your own goals are as you go through different time zones, as it were, in a therapy. So we have followed suit in the same way, and we conceptualized it as having three different phases. The first phase is what we call the initial phase, and here it's about engaging the patient and doing an exploration that will allow us to arrive at a psychodynamic formulation that will provide the focus of the work, and I will say more about this shortly. This is approximately sessions 1 to 4, and I say approximately because obviously every patient and therapist dyad operates at slightly different speeds. You know, you can have some patients and therapists who, after 2 sessions, have got a formulation in hand. There are others who, by session 6, haven't got it because perhaps it's much harder to understand the patient. Or sometimes the therapist themselves isn't that suited to this way of working. I mean, I think that's an important point. Not everyone actually likes or is as good at brief therapy as they are at longer-term therapy. And I think one of the most important competences that we all have to develop as clinicians is to know what our strengths and limitations are. I know that I would be a lousy CBT therapist if I really tried to do CBT properly, yeah? And there's no point in me doing it because it just isn't something I can do very well. Or I'm not that good at working with people with severe addictions. It's not where my mind goes. And I think knowing that is quite important. So working briefly, particularly in this way, doesn't kind of come to everyone. And it doesn't make you a bad therapist. It just makes you not the best DIT therapist. And I think you need to know that. So by and large, by session 4, you'd hope to arrive at a formulation, but there are going to be exceptions to this. The middle phase then is approximately sessions 5 to 12, and this is really where you get to work on the focus. But of course the work begins the moment the patient comes into your door at session 1, so it's not that the work hasn't begun, but more that by session 5 you will have an agreed focus with the patient that is going to give you the spine, if you like, for what's to follow in the remaining sessions. And like all psychodynamic brief interventions, we put a lot of emphasis on the work of ending. So we distinguish what ends up getting called the termination phase or the ending phase, and that's in this model approximately sessions 13 to 16. And one of the things that we do in this model that's distinctive to usher in the beginning of the end, as it were, is that we give what we call a goodbye letter in draft form at session 13, so that it's very clear to both therapist and patient that you are now in the final sort of bit, the final stretch of the therapy. And again, I'll come back to the letter later. This is just to give you an overview of the 3 phases. Now, I really emphasize that these phases and what we call them are for your benefit as a therapist and not for the patient. So, for example, I had a wonderful student who, approaching the ending phase, said to the patient, who was extremely anxious and had a lot of separation anxiety, said, "We are now going to enter the termination phase," which actually sounded pretty kind of lethal and final. So the patient doesn't need to hear that that's where you are in the model, but obviously you need to work with the ending from the very beginning because it is a brief therapy. So you've got to be very mindful of that. With some patients, you might every session say, we have 6 sessions left, 5 sessions left. With others, you may not feel it's so necessary, but you definitely need to know where you are in this overall structure. The therapeutic stance, I won't say too much because I hope that I've conveyed that in the session we had before the break, that really the therapist is quite supportive, you're quite involved, you're quite active, you aim to work very collaboratively with the patient from the outset, you're very explicit about what you understand, what you're trying to work to, you check in with the patient quite a lot. You adopt what we call the not knowing stance, which is taken from mentalization. This doesn't mean that you pretend you know nothing, but that you actually own your own beliefs and understandings as your own and not as the final truth about the patient. And this is very important to us in this model, that within psychoanalysis, at its worst, what it can end up being is an analyst telling the patient that they know better than the patient what is in the patient's mind. And that's definitely an attitude that we try to curb very quickly in all the people who do our training, that actually we're not experts in people's minds. The patient is the expert on their mind. We have a range of techniques that have been useful to some people, and the patient will tell us if they're helpful to them. So it's about marking, this is what I've understood. I now need you to help me to understand if this actually sheds any helpful light on what you're struggling with. So that's what we mean by the not knowing stance. We are quite active in our sort of the amount that we say. It doesn't mean that we talk all the time, but when we do the training in England, on the final day of the training, you have to do a role play with an actor. So an actor comes in and pretends to be a depressed patient, and you'll videotape for 15 minutes. And then we rate the tapes to see if people have the aptitude to do the work. And even though I stress we've only got 15 minutes to assess you, and although there are some nods and some mms that I'm sure are more therapeutic than others, unless we actually hear you make some interventions, it's very, very hard to assess your aptitude. Trust me, there are always some psychoanalytic colleagues who will say virtually nothing for 15 minutes, which makes it very hard to know, can you actually work in this model? Because one of the big differences between this way of working and the more classical way of working is that you are trying to be much more transparent about your understanding of the patient from the very beginning. So whereas in classical psychoanalysis, you and your supervisor have these amazing conversations about what's going on in the patient's mind, and the patient is never given a formulation about this. They get interpretations informed by these formulations. Indeed, you put your cards on the table. At session 4, you say to your patient, this is what I've understood, this is the formulation, you now tell me if this makes sense to you. Now, for therapists, that is actually quite challenging to do. You know, you can't hide behind what your supervisor might be thinking. You've got to kind of go in there and say, this is what I've understood, and bring together a lot of information very rapidly. You know, you've got 3 sessions really to do this in, that makes something that feels very difficult for the patient much more coherent, and from which you will develop goals. Now, goals is the terrible, terrible word in psychoanalysis. And indeed, I'm afraid we do talk about goals. We do actually formulate goals that are relevant to the focus you've agreed on with the patient, and that you will help the patient to begin at least to work towards. Okay, so it is a goal-setting sort of approach, not in the kind of CBT way that, you know, you're going to do some homework and come back next week, but more that we've identified this relational pattern that's problematic. Let's think about what you would like to do differently in your relationships. So the relational focus is the key aspect of how you're setting goals in this model too. So the big thing in DIT that you've got to get your heads around is how we formulate in this model. And here I very much want to acknowledge Otto Kernberg's writings, because certainly the formulation that we've adopted of looking at self, other, affect as the link comes absolutely from Dr. Kernberg's work. And there are a number of ways of formulating that are around. If you've studied David Malan's triangle, for example, you know, there are lots of different ways that you can formulate. We were trying to come up with a way of formulating that was easier for people to get their heads around, and we found that this was probably an easier way of formulating. So it's not that we think the others are no good, it's just that for us this seemed to be, just had more clarity to it. So this is the interpersonal affective focus. Interpersonal is important. You're looking at patterns of relating. Affective, these patterns of relating mobilize particularly strong affects usually in us, and therefore the work is always attending to affect and what's going on in relationships. Affect, what's going on in relationships. If you're just talking about relationships and you're not mentioning affect, you may be doing something amazingly wonderful, but it's not called it. You've got to really keep focused on affect as it's mobilized in relationships. And that's actually quite a helpful thing to have in your minds when you go into a session and you're listening to yourself as to what interventions you're making. That brings you back to base if you feel that you're not really focused on affect at all. Yeah? Now, the IPAF provides what we call the spine of the work. So it allows you to remember that although lots of interesting material will come up in your therapy, unlike if you had an open-ended psychoanalysis, you're not going to be able to follow every dream the patient brings or every association, because you and the patient very explicitly have agreed to work on one relational pattern. And that agreed relational pattern is what keeps you focused and allows you to do some meaningful work within a relatively short space of time. And one thing I would say about this, because many times today I've heard myself say relatively short, brief. I mean, 16 sessions is brief, but we're not necessarily shortchanging our patients. One of the big problems is that when psychoanalytic therapists do brief therapy, they think, I'm doing this because I'm under tremendous pressure to do this, because we don't have the resources. Now, sometimes that is true, that what our patients need is long-term work, and we are shortchanging them, but not always. And one of the things that for me was the biggest learning lesson with IPT that I was sharing with you earlier was that I could see significant, dramatic, really moving changes in patients in the context of 16 sessions of IPT. Yeah? So we mustn't go in with that attitude that, ooh, really, in an ideal world, I'd be seeing you 5 times a week for 20 years. Because actually, maybe those analyses that last 20 years are lasting so long because we're not really being very critical. Yeah? It's very, very important to be critical of ourselves. And I include myself in this. I can think of one patient in particular. I'm sure that if I believed in God, I would think that something terrible was going to happen to me, that I'm sure I didn't help this patient. And I kept her in therapy for years, longer than she would have needed to be in if I had actually had the skills I now have. Yeah, so it's not a nice thought to think about one's own work with that perspective, but I think honesty is quite important, otherwise we don't actually learn and update our skills. So, the goals that you develop in it have got to be relevant to the focus that you've identified. So, it's no good saying, what's your goal? Well, I want to be happier. Well, we all want to be happier, and after 3 analyses, I am a lot happier than I was, but I wouldn't say I'm ecstatically happy all the time. Happiness isn't something that therapy is going to give you like that. You've got to really define the goal as relevant to the focus. So if part of the focus is, I always feel criticized by others, what is it that you want to do differently that might begin to shift that dynamic? So in other words, the reason that goals are helpful is not because we need to know where we're going, I mean, that is important too, but because working at the goal is the beginning of the work. Because in order to know where you want to get to, you've got to really think about what you want to change. And then you've got to think about, why is change so difficult? Why have I got these defenses in place? What is it going to mean for me to relinquish a way of doing things that, painful though it is, actually, I know exactly where I am. It's my map. I know exactly where I'm going. I may pay a price for it. But to give that up for uncertainty, are you mad? You know, why would I want to do this? So the work of identifying goals is actually beginning to do the work of therapy. So that's why we think it's quite important, because the moment you engage the patient in thinking about goals, you're off into your middle phase of the work, which is really where the bulk of the work takes place. So the IPAF, as we define it, that's it. So that will give you a visual representation of what we're trying to do. So we're listening in the first 4 sessions. Remember, you're in the initial phase. You've been given license to ask questions as long as the questions are illuminating what's going on in relationships. This is not just about asking any question. The questions have got to be in the service of bringing to the fore repetitive interpersonal and affective patterns, okay? So as long as your questions are relevant to that quest, then you're on model, yeah? So when you're doing the training, we talk a lot about being on model, because we're listening to tapes, trying to help therapists to learn what interventions are appropriate to this model and what interventions, though they may be very helpful, are actually off model because they belong to CBT or some other approach. So your patient is bringing narratives in the initial sessions, and for every interpersonal narrative, you, as a therapist in your mind, have got this picture. You're trying to listen out to what is the recurrent self-representation, what is the object representation that's activated in that moment, and very importantly, what is the affect that is mobilized when a particular self and object representation comes alive in the patient's mind. So just as an illustration, you could have a self-representation of myself as a very needy baby, very demanding infant. When I feel like a needy baby, the object representation that comes up in my mind is of a rejecting mother. So if I ever am needy, I'm always meeting in my mind this very rejecting other. Yeah, that's what happens. And when I feel that, when I'm in that relationship in my mind, what I feel is absolute terror. Okay? Now, one of the things we try to do with the IPAF is to understand what's going on in terms of the object representation, because often the object representation actually reflects what we have split off and can't own in ourselves. So there is a defensive function to the IPAF. We maintain this pattern where the other is felt by us to be, as in this example, rejecting, because actually we can't bear yet to look at the part of us that can be very rejecting of others, because that would mean we would have to own some aggression instead of kind of seeing ourselves as the victim of some terrible person out there who constantly does these terrible things to us. Now, of course, as you will know from your clinical work, to get to that point where you can take responsibility for what you're projecting into your objects is very hard work, and not always possible to do this work in 16 sessions. And I think we just need to be realistic about that. So we may have a very good formulation of what the patient is splitting off and projecting into the object, but we may not, with some patients, get them to that point. So the way to think about it is that you're beginning a journey of peeling off the layers of this pattern, and the patient may sometimes need to go on to other therapy, whether it's a group where they can begin to do the further work, or with some patients they may go on into an analysis after a brief intervention. It really does vary. For other patients, this is enough. They can do the work. But I remember that when I was training myself as an analyst, one of the most helpful things that I was taught was a distinction that John Steiner, who's a British psychoanalyst, as some of you will have read his book Psychic Retreats, which is it's a classic book when you're training in the British Society. One of the distinctions he makes is between patients who want to be understood and patients who want understanding. Now, if you have a patient who just wants to be understood, so someone who just wants to hear what a terrible, terrible time you've had, it was awful that your mother treated you in that way, it's going to be very hard to do this kind of work. They may need to be in that space for too long for you to be able to harness enough of a capacity to actually take some ownership for the perpetuation of the pattern. The patient, by contrast, who wants understanding in John Steiner's terms, is actually the patient who usually can do the work much more quickly. But think of your own experiences as patients, for those of you who've been in therapy. I mean, after 15 years of 5 times a week psychoanalysis, I know that there were patterns that were sometimes so hard for me to kind of come back to and take responsibility for what I was doing to my objects. So imagine what we're asking of people to do that work in 16 sessions. So I'm saying both that you can do very meaningful work, but also we have to be realistic about what can be achieved, particularly with some individuals who may have greater difficulty with integrating split-off aspects of themselves. Now, one of the technical aspects of DIT that is very informed by mentalization theory is that we retain a very consistent focus on the patient's mental state, that is, their beliefs, feelings, wishes, thoughts, but obviously we do that in relation to the focus that we've agreed on. So at session 4, you will be sharing with the patient what I was showing you a minute ago, whatever the self, other, and affect are, which will be completely idiosyncratic for every patient. And this was very important to us because, to go back to IPT, for example, the way that IPT operates is that you are given 4 potential focal areas that you, as it were, slot your patient into. You know, your patient is depressed because, for example, as IPT would say, there's been a grief situation or there's been a transition. So the therapy provides you with categories that you put your patient into. DIT doesn't operate in that way. It gives you the skeleton framework, but the formulation is absolutely idiographic. You know, each patient will have a different formulation, even to the point that you might have the same self and object representation for 2 patients, but the affect that links the 2 is different. Yeah? And I think that's quite important, that you're really trying to get to the specifics. And I think the more helpful DIT therapies are ones that make this skeleton as personal as possible, so that you find words for the self-representation that capture something really resonant with the patient. It's very easy to talk about a rejecting other, but what color, what shape, what feeling does that rejecting other have for that particular person? So much of the work of the early sessions is about listening out for words, or to pick up on the point that one of the Chilean colleagues, whose name I'm afraid I don't know, made earlier. What is it? Jimena made earlier. You might be using your somatic countertransference to absolutely capture something that is important in terms of getting to this much more resonant, specific word that you'll come up with. And I promise you, the more specific and resonant it is, the more powerful it is for the patient. Yeah? So we've got our focus, and really the biggest technical intervention is about remaining focused on mental state. So as the patient, week after week, brings in different experiences with others, you are trying to get them to think about what they imagine to be going on in other people's minds about them, and what they are imagining or thinking at any given point about other people. So the mentalizing focus is very important. Whether and when you use specific mentalizing techniques, and this is different, will depend on whether your patient is a patient who has significant deficits in mentalizing or whether they don't. So the important thing here is to distinguish MBT, mentalization-based therapy, which, as you know, was developed by Peter Fonning and Anthony Bateman specifically for the treatment of borderline patients, and DIT. DIT is absolutely a psychoanalytic approach that is very preoccupied with sustaining mentalizing, and does this in a very particular way, and occasionally uses mentalizing techniques in those moments when mentalizing is not operating at its best. But it is not the same as MBT. So this is quite an important distinction. The modification of the approach that I mentioned at the outset in 26 sessions shares more in common with MBT, though it still has the same formulation as in the original DIT model, because there we are, by definition, working with personality disordered patients, by and large, who are also depressed, and for whom mentalizing is a significant deficit. Okay? So there there's a little bit more free borrowing of mentalizing sort of techniques than there is in this original 16-session model. Okay, we keep very much a here and now focus, and we're using that term a bit differently to how it's used in classical psychoanalysis. Here and now in psychoanalysis tends to mean the transference. We don't mean just the transference. We mean that we're working on current problems in relationships. That's what we mean by the here and now. So in other words, if we have a patient who starts to want to talk a great deal about what happened when they were 5 years old, we would be obviously very sensitive to why that's significant, but we would try to bring the patient back to the here and now of their current life, informed as it might be by whatever was significant about what happened when they were 5. But if we listen to tapes of people training in DIT and they're spending a long time talking about early events, unless it occurs in the first 4 sessions when you're still formulating and therefore need information about early events, if that is still happening in the middle phase, we would think that the person is actually going off model quite a lot. Yeah? And if you think about it, you can't afford to spend too much time just talking about the past because you're trying to address current interpersonal problems, and you have got 16 sessions, not 2 years to do that. So again, that's something that, there are losses, as I said at the outset, but there are also gains that come with some of the restrictions and modifications. That isn't to say that you don't use the transference. You absolutely do use the transference. But one of the helpful distinctions that arose out of the work that we did on the competencies that I mentioned right at the beginning this morning is that we made a distinction between using the transference and interpreting the transference. Okay? So in DIT, you're always 100% of the time using the transference insofar as you are constantly formulating psychodynamically about what you understand to be going on between you and the patient. Yeah? So always using it in that sense. Interpreting it, we do in a much more circumscribed way. So it's always the internal backdrop. This is part of the analytic attitude. Remember at the outset that I said you've really got to protect and safeguard. But whether and when you actually choose to interpret the transference has got to be informed primarily by whether you consider that a transference interpretation adds something to talking to the patient more straightforwardly about the activation of that pattern in their current external relationships. Okay? So what we're inviting you as therapists to do is to put aside the teachings of a classical psychoanalytic approach that privileges the interpretation of the transference as the cornerstone technique, and some psychoanalytic schools do that more than others, and to take a step back and say, okay, sometimes maybe that's true. Is it always true? Is it always the best way to intervene? What if you have a patient who comes in, begins a session telling you this very animated story about some dispute that they're having with someone very significant to them, and you've agreed with them your IPAF, so you know what the focus is, and this story shows you in technicolor this activation of this pattern. Now the question there is, what would be the value of interpreting that in the transference and not actually using that real life, very effectively real story to help the patient to see the pattern that's been activated? Yeah, so that's what we're asking you to do. With patients who have very few relationships, or with patients who have real difficulty with emotional connection, there would be good reasons for interpreting in the transference, because for a start, they probably won't bring a story that's so effectively alive, or they may not have any stories at all because they go from their room to your office and don't see anyone in the whole week. So what are you going to draw on? So if you have that kind of patient, then obviously working in the transference is extremely helpful, because that's the only relationship you've got going, as it were, in order to help you to understand what's happening inside the patient's mind. So we are inviting the DIT therapist to be a bit more discriminating about where and why to make a transference interpretation. And undoubtedly there is room for those interpretations, but we probably make less of them than in other psychodynamic approaches. Okay? But we use it all the time to help us to understand where we are in relation to our patient at any given point in time. Because it's only a good understanding of the transference that would allow you to make some assessment of whether the patient can make use of what you're saying to them or not, because you'll be able to feel that through the transference, counter-transference dynamic that you're formulating as you're going along. One of the things that we introduced in the model is this notion of the cautionary tale, which I know from what Carla told me is very difficult to translate cautionary tale. Interestingly, all the translations in different languages of the model have struggled with this term. The Italians had this difficulty too. They didn't know what word to find for it. But the term actually comes from Thomas Ogden's writings, and he was writing about first assessments. And he was talking about how if you listen carefully in your first meeting with a patient, there will often be what he termed a cautionary tale that will give you some insight into what anxieties are mobilized by virtue of them beginning a relationship with you. So we thought that this was actually quite a helpful way of speaking to the early activation of the IPAF in relation to the person or the therapist, which would give you additional information alongside all the narratives that you're eliciting about current relationships, but you've also got something that kind of is very alive between you and the patient. And the idea is to try to put on the table between you and the patient very early on, usually by session 2, what they're really worried about in terms of starting working with you, and might there be characteristic defenses that they might be already telling you about that they are at risk of employing in order to defend themselves against the anxieties mobilized by coming into therapy. Okay, so for example, I had a patient who arrived for an initial assessment where they were about 10 minutes late and arrived very flustered. They were very red in the face and with this long story about how terrible the parking was near where I lived. That's why he was late. There was absolutely no space. He almost got a space and some other car came in and he really hoped I would give him more time because this wasn't his fault. And the session kind of progressed and there were a number of stories. And one of the most striking ones was a story about taking a stained suit that he had to the dry cleaner. Dry cleaner? Lavanderia. Yeah. And he went into exceptional detail about taking the suit in, showing the dry cleaner that there was the stain, and asking the dry cleaner, could the dry cleaner guarantee that he would take the stain away? Because if he couldn't guarantee it, he wouldn't leave him the suit. And he said, the guy said, of course I can take the stain away. He went back a week later, collected his suit, the stain was still there, he was outraged, and he walked out refusing to pay because the guy didn't do his job. So you can imagine the interpretation. The cautionary tale was very clear, So we would try to make that interpretation very early on, partly to also see how the patient manages to hear that kind of thing. Yeah? So that's what we call the cautionary tale, and that would inform the sort of IPAF that you eventually arrive at in session 4. Okay. Now, as I said when we looked at that diagram of the IPAF, the reason we maintain certain templates of ourselves in relation to others is because they serve a defensive function. They allow us to place in other people, to project into our object aspects of ourselves that are quite difficult. So when you are giving an IPAF to a patient in session 4, and by giving what I mean, you're sharing where you have got to in your understanding and then inviting the patient to help you to refine it, you may not be sharing everything, not because you want to lie to the patient, but because you are sensitive to what they can bear to hear. If by session 4 you say to a patient, I think you see everyone as rejecting and critical of you because you can't bear to look at the critical aspects in yourself, you may lose your patient because they may not be able to look at that in themselves. So you're titrating the IPAF to where you think your patient is at, and the work of the middle phase is to gradually edge them closer and closer to the fullness of the IPAF in time. Sometimes you may not be able to do the whole thing, but with some patients you undoubtedly can. So remember that this is about a work in progress. So the formulation at session 4 is there to engage the patient enough to have a sense that there is a pattern that's repeating itself. It's not too scary so that they keep coming back, and it allows you to begin to formulate some meaningful goals relative to this pattern. Okay. Now, one of the constant sort of things that we hear when we do the training is therapists saying, how can I focus on just one pattern? You know, how is that possible? And what we say is that actually, though we are all infinitely so interesting, if you really think about your experiences if you've been in therapy, how many patterns have you looked at that actually are helpful to you? I can say that in 15 years I looked at 2 patterns, and maybe that makes me a very sad person, but actually I suspect I'm probably fairly representative. And we looked at these 2 patterns from different angles and different depths. We just took them apart, but actually it wasn't that there were 1,000,001 patterns that I had to look at. So it's not so difficult, actually, to find a pattern. Where it gets difficult, and this is actually a very reliable sign you've got a borderline patient, is where you have 10 epaphs. You think, oh my God, it could go, and actually that's because borderline patients are very rapidly oscillating in different kind of states of mind. But most people don't have that sort of presentation. And if there are 2 competing patterns, because indeed you're being so explicit, you're not making the decision on behalf of the patient, you say to the patient, I can see these 2 things, these 2 patterns. What feels most pressing or urgent to you? What do you want to address? So that's how you can approach that problem. But more importantly, the way we think about the epaph in DIT is that we think that it is one way, and the preferred way within the DIT model, of engaging the patient in mentalizing. So if the ultimate goal is actually to sustain a capacity to mentalize, it's less important that you've got the primary epaph, the most important truth about the patient, but more that there's enough there that engages the patient in being able to mentalize, and that's really what's driving your treatment. So we're saying all this to kind of help you to feel a bit less stressed about having to come up with this kind of epaph. But obviously, having the epaph is important, and once you've formulated it, it is the spine. So one of the things we also notice is that some therapists do these amazingly helpful epaphs with their patients. They present them at session 4. Then you listen to the tapes in the middle treatment, and there isn't a single trace of the epaph. It's like it's completely forgotten. They feel, phew, I got through the first full session, I passed that tape, and then suddenly the epaph has disappeared. So it's very, very important to actually, almost like before every session, look at your notes and remind yourself of what you've actually contracted to work on with the patient. I think that's really, really important. The other very important technical aspect of the epaph is that, and this is very understandable when you're very early on with the model, you get quite anxious about wanting to get it right. So you've formulated your epaph, you've got your supervisor who said, brilliant, I got your stamp of approval, and you go into the session and you start to deliver this kind of dialogue that goes on for about 15 minutes, and the patient, when you watch the videos, you can see the patient is kind of completely sort of gone, you've lost them. So the skill in the epaph is that it gives you the beginning of a dialogue. So the way that the session would go would be to say, you start session 4, you've done your forms, your outcome monitoring forms, and you would say to the patient something like, I've been giving a lot of thought to our discussions in the last 3 weeks, and I've got a few ideas about what I think might be a problematic pattern, and I just want to kind of share these with you, and I really need your help to arrive at something that's going to be of help to you. So you might start by saying, my sense is that repeatedly you find yourself in these relationships where you end up feeling, I'm a good for nothing. I'm utterly useless. Does that sound true to you? And the patient will say, yes, it does. Okay, let's think together. Is there a word that captures that utterly useless? Is there something that really resonates with you? So you're going to go into that. Once you've done that with the self-representation and you've got some agreement, you then say, okay, so what I've also noticed is that when you feel I'm a good for nothing, or whatever word you've arrived at with the patient, it seems to me that in your mind, it's as if you're having this conversation with someone who's always berating you, always saying you're a good for nothing. They're very critical. Does that sound right? Do you feel there's always this kind of critical voice going on inside your mind? And the patient might say yes. You say, okay, so let's find a word for that critical part of your mind. Yeah? So that's how you build it up, step by step. So that can take the whole session. Yeah? So you don't go in with this kind of long story, and then you sit there and expect the patient to say, marvelous, you've suddenly got the whole of me. But when you do this carefully, although there should be no surprises, because of course in the preceding sessions, if you've been doing DIT, you are constantly checking in because you're making mini interpretations, saying, oh, so when you're with Mary, that's when you feel you're a good for nothing, but not when you're with John or whatever it might be. So is that right? So you've checked this in with the patients. There should be no surprises. But by the time you pull it all together and you help the patient to begin to think about why they've, how this relates to their symptoms, which is why they're coming to see you, sometimes this is an incredibly moving experience, because although we're very adept at formulating and we therefore can apply it to ourselves, that's part of one of the things we get from our trainings, that we get this capacity to formulate. For most people who are not trained professionals, bringing together a lifetime of experience in something as schematic as the IPAF actually can be really revelatory. So you mustn't underestimate the important impact you can have on the patient, even though to you this may feel like second nature, or you may think, well, I'm not saying such a big deal. But actually to be able to have something that cuts to the chase in this way is a very important gift that you can give to someone in terms of beginning to understand their mind. Okay. Now, I said a few minutes ago that one of the strengths, I think, of the DIT model is that the formulation is very idiographic. Having said that, when you see hundreds, literally hundreds of patients who are depressed, you start to see some patterns in the kinds of depression that come up. And if you haven't read Sidney Blatt's work, I would strongly recommend you read his work. Sadly, he died not so long ago, but he was a wonderful inspiration, I think, to many of us. And I think a very good example of how you can combine being a serious researcher, an academic, and clinician, and think psychoanalytically. No small feat these days, but he managed to do all of those exceptionally well. And one of the things that he did through research was to make a distinction that we think is very valuable when you're applying DIT with depressed patients between what he called introjective and anaclitic types of depression. So the introjective depression is where the self feels unlovable or worthless, and therefore these sorts of patients tend to be relating to an object in their minds that's usually expected to be quite humiliating and undermining. So, in other words, patients who have very harsh superegos. And the other kind of depressed patient is what he called the anaclitic sort of type of depression. Here the self feels more unloved rather than unlovable, and there's much more helplessness, much more dependency, and the object is often experienced as someone who is going to be inaccessible or abandoning, as opposed to critical and humiliating. So by and large, I would say that this is borne out in my experience of both my work with depressed patients, but now after years of supervising DIT, of hundreds of tapes of depressed patients, that there is a kind of way in which, by and large, with obviously idiosyncratic sort of edges, patients kind of divide up in these two ways. Now, what was interesting about Blatt's research is that he showed, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, that the patients who have the more anaclitic type of depression, so these are the very dependent patients, where you might expect Well, these are not going to do well in brief therapy because they're going to get very dependent. No sooner are they dependent, they're going to say it's over. So we shouldn't actually give them brief therapy. But in fact, the patients with anaclitic type depressions do better than the patients with introjective type depressions. Because in part, they are so kind of focused on the object, they so much want something from you that they engage. Now, you have to then help them to disengage, but at least you've got a patient who kind of wants to be there, and they're very anxious if you're not there, so they create all sorts of other challenges, technically speaking, but they're in there. The first kind of patient actually is so persecuted from within and so convinced that nothing good can come from the other, that in a brief therapy, by session 4, you're struggling to keep the patient in the room, let alone formulate and engage them and give them some hope that in the next 12 sessions you're going to be of some help to them. So those patients, by and large, do less well. And in fact, I suppose when we're talking about the adaptation of DIT to the 26-session model, we have in mind those sorts of patients much more. And we have a longer initial phase precisely so that we can address those sorts of transference issues which get in the way of engaging the patient in doing some focused work. So as a kind of assessment framework, Blatt's work is actually extremely helpful. So I do encourage you to go and read more of what he did. So in terms of deciding what to select, I suppose you're trying to select as a focus, as an IPAF, something that is meaningfully connected to the onset of the symptoms. So remember that this therapy is for patients who are referred to you because of depressive symptoms. Whether you believe in the psychiatric diagnosis of depression or not, we all recognize that some patients come with a range of symptoms that are deeply problematic to them. So you're trying to help them to see the relevance of the IPAF relative to the onset of their symptoms. Otherwise, it's hard to engage them in working on a focus if they can't see how it connects with what they're actually asking your help with. It's got to be effectively meaningful. So the patient has really got to feel that this is something they want to work on. If they feel lukewarm about it, you're not going to have enough of a motor to work in a focused way in a brief therapy. And I think it's important to find the focus, a pattern, that you see manifesting in a range of interpersonal domains. If the pattern is only apparent to the patient in one relationship, but at work and everywhere else, absolutely fine, either they're very defended, or maybe the pattern actually isn't the most relevant one, because by and large, the patterns that really are problematic will be manifest in different ways across a range of relational domains. So you're trying to find something, and you'll know that because you will have been asking the right sorts of questions in the initial phase of the therapy, in sessions 1 to 3. Okay. So before I give you a case study, I'm going to fast forward to the end of the therapy so that you have a sense of what happens in the last 4 sessions, and then we'll wrap up with a case from my own practice which addresses the question of using the somatic countertransference too. So you get to session 12 in DIT, and you say to the patient at session 12, during the coming week, I'm going to put in draft form some thoughts about where we've got to, and I'm going to bring that in next week so that you and I can begin to look at it together so that we can see where we've got to, because we now only have 4 sessions left. So it's a way of sort of introducing the fact of ending, and it's also a way of beginning to pull together what you've achieved so far. But this letter, which is then presented in session 13, is indeed only a draft. And you will continue to work on it with the patient up until the very last session when you finally give them this letter to take away. And we call it in the model the goodbye letter. We don't say to the patient, this is your goodbye letter, but that's how we reference to it. Now, what's very interesting when you see a lot of cases is to notice that those therapies that were probably a bit stuck in the middle phase are often kind of released a bit from the stuckness after the letter. The letter is quite a key moment. Now, the letter is not our invention. Cognitive analytic therapy, developed by Anthony Ryle, that some of you may be familiar with, uses letters very productively in the context of that therapy. They have 2 letters, one that they give around session 4, so after the assessment, and one that they give right at the end. So we are doing it very differently. We don't have the one at the beginning for 2 reasons. The most important reason is that we think that to put the formulation in writing makes it fixed, whereas we think that formulation at the beginning is the beginning of the work and should be refined, so that by putting it in writing, it just concretizes it too much. Also, pragmatically, therapists in public health service settings have a lot of admin work, and we thought to ask them to write 2 letters is a bit much. And the colleagues in cognitive analytic therapy give their letter right at the end, literally as a kind of goodbye letter. We wanted to weave it into the therapy as part of the work between therapist and patient. And that's why we give the first draft at session 13 and continue to work on it. I should say that the letter was put in there because Mary Target and I, when we reflected on our analysis, we thought, God, we've both had years of psychoanalysis and we don't really know what our analyst actually thought was wrong with us because they never gave us a formulation. So we tried to do what we longed to have got from our own analyst, which is a letter. We ended up sort of displacing this longing and thwarted longing, I should say, in the therapy that we developed. But the letter remains in our minds one of the areas that really deserves more study as to what is the function of this letter. We can see that affectively it's very powerful for most patients, and where it isn't, it's also very interesting why it isn't. But it's unclear, does it help with relapse prevention? We know certainly from some of the doctors we work with in surgeries where patients are being referred for DIT, that the doctor says, or the patient has come back 6 months later referring to the letter and saying it was quite helpful to go back and look at it and be reminded of the pattern. But of course you could say what they're reminded of is the good object relationship established with the therapist. Is it a kind of transitional object? What is the function of this letter? So if any of you are looking for a research project, I think there's something to be understood in terms of these letters. Certainly the experience we have so far is that most patients find it very moving. Therapists find it very hard to write. It's very difficult to kind of really succinctly yet effectively sort of compose a letter that captures the essence of the therapy and of the relationship. But also, pragmatically, patients don't know what to do with this letter. Where does it go? Let alone in services, who owns this letter? Is this a letter that goes in patient notes? It's a very personal letter. Patients probably wouldn't want it in their notes. But so those are all the legal aspects of who owns this letter. But from a patient point of view, some patients think, oh, this is so personal, I don't know where to put it. Someone might read it. Or you have patients who go home at the end of the therapy, put the letter on the mantelpiece as if they're trying to communicate to a partner, this is what you need to understand about me, here, read it, you know. So it's quite interesting what patients do with this letter. Anyway, let me just very briefly give you a case study, and then we'll leave 10 minutes hopefully for some questions and feedback from you before stopping. So this is a good example of a case of DIT that I struggled with. I think it's very easy to come up with cases where you do a fantastic job, but actually there are many cases where we don't do such a fantastic job. And this patient I really, really struggled with. So he came to see me having been referred by his doctor because he'd been signed off work. He'd had a very stressful experience at work where he had been told that this report that he'd done, and he put a lot of effort into it, actually he felt had been criticized by his boss in front of colleagues, and this had provoked quite a severe depressive collapse. So as you can imagine, it's unlikely that that would cause that, but clearly it activated something in the patient that was clearly very resonant with a lot of earlier experiences. And when he came into my room, one of the things that I was very struck by, to go back to sort of how we might use our somatic countertransference, was that he was very, very hunched. It's as if he kind of lost several inches in height because he was so sort of hunched. And he sat on the edge of the chair, and I was very aware that I started to feel very uncomfortable, whereas usually I would sit back. I was also much more kind of, a bit more like I am here, sort of, not that I'm tense now, but I wouldn't normally sit on the edge of my chair when I'm seeing patients. And it was very difficult to really engage him. He was very negative about everything. He was very aspirational, felt that it was very important to be the brightest, the best at everything. So, of course, that experience at work where he had felt that something he had produced hadn't sort of yielded the approval of others was utterly shattering for him. He had a younger brother with whom he clearly had been often in competition. His own father had died when he was quite young, and he felt that the brother was more like the father, and particularly he talked a great deal about their height, their physical height. So he said that his brother was very tall, that the father had stature, by which he meant literally that he was tall, but also that he had achieved a great deal in his own professional field. And it was very clear to me that when I tried to make any kind of intervention, he was the sort of patient that kind of yes, but. So nothing was kind of quite right. You always had to kind of qualify it, and it really did have a bit of an edge. So we arrived at session 4 with this IPAF where the self-representation was small and insignificant, and the object representation was tall and with stature, and therefore much better than him and quite critical, looking down on him. And the feeling that was mobilized was that he kind of became completely paralyzed. So the affect was of a complete paralysis, which is exactly what had happened at work. He just couldn't get out of bed, he couldn't go to work. And for several weeks, we kept going on with this IPAF, and it felt right intellectually, but nothing was happening. He was being critical of me, but at times I thought with good reason, because actually I didn't feel I could reach this man. Until at one point, he always wore shirts, usually sort of buttoned down to here. And on this particular day, it was quite a hot day, so he had rolled up the sleeve of his shirt, which was very unusual for him, because he was very buttoned up, very uptight. And as he sort of made a movement, I noticed that there was a little bit of a tattoo that was revealed by the shirt going up, which completely jolted me. It was the first lively thing that had happened, because this man was so sort of complete. I thought, he's got a tattoo? It was completely, I would never put money on the fact that he had a tattoo. And I thought, gosh, why has this struck me so much? It was the physical, me suddenly feeling almost a sense of kind of breathing again, that I thought, this is so interesting. I've been tense, now I'm breathing, and all I've seen is a little bit of a tattoo. I don't even know what it is. And so I took a risk there. I sort of commented on how he'd been very rigid, and that I had obviously not managed to help him. And that yet I'd sort of caught a glimpse of something today on him that I hoped wouldn't make him feel intruded upon, because I think when we use the body, whether it's our own bodily reactions or noticing the patient's, we've got to be very mindful of the potential that is always there for shaming the patient and making him or her feel very intruded upon. So I was very mindful of that, and I said, but I just noticed that you have a tattoo, and I'm just interested in that. And at that point, he also opened up a bit, telling me the story of this tattoo. And what then emerged, and we were by now at session 8, so according to the model, not doing well here. The IPAF wasn't kind of in gear. And of course, he disclosed that he thought he was gay, homosexual, which is something he'd never talked to anyone about, and he felt deep shame about. Now, suddenly, the IPAF, which we didn't have to change, was emotionally resonant, because this lacking stature actually had to do with a view of himself as completely castrated by the fact that he couldn't be a man like his brother and his father, but that actually felt he had to somehow be like them, but that was going against who he felt he was. And in that moment of the tattoo, which obviously had been his first attempt at kind of distinguishing himself, but then felt terrible about it, so covered it up all the time, and explained to me that his mother would have been horrified if she'd seen this tattoo, so he had to conceal it all the time. Suddenly, the work could actually begin to start. So the IPAF itself didn't change, but we could relate to it, both of us, in an emotionally resonant way. And it was actually through something quite bodily that happened. So The manual doesn't tell you, look at the tattoos your patient has. You've got to really go off-piste sometimes. All the manual does is that it provides you with a benchmark against which you can question yourself if you're going off-piste. If you're doing something that the manual says you shouldn't be doing, then you've got to be answerable to yourself as to why you're doing it. So it gives you a discipline. But the manual should never, ever be implemented as if it were a Bible, because then you'll do very bad therapy, just as you would be a very bad cook if you followed your recipes down to a T. You've got to kind of sometime put in your special ingredients, as it were. But do it in a way that is obviously systematic and open to challenge. So I shall end on that note. I hope that answers a little bit your question. So we've got almost 15 minutes, and any questions, observations?
What can you say about this personality configuration using the theory of Sidney Blatt?
Of this patient, that definitely an introjective. Definitely. When I gave this patient the goodbye letter at session 13, you can be a bit flexible around this, but you have 2 copies usually in the room with you so that the patient can read, and the patient can take the letter home so that they can look at it. So he took it home and came back the following week with red marks correcting my grammar in English. And he said, of course, as a foreigner, you make lots of mistakes. Now, my English isn't brilliant, but it's not that bad. And it was quite interesting because, of course, it took us right back to where he started. He had obviously felt his own project had been criticized by the boss. So despite the work that we'd done, that part of him, these things are very hard to completely change, as we well know, kind of was activated just at the point where I reminded him that we were then stopping. So it was his way of also communicating something about what he felt about the end. But it kind of manifested through the way that he related to what I'd given him. So at that point, he couldn't quite just be appreciative. He had to sort of completely undo it. And that's very typical of these very persecuted individuals. When you're training, you mean?
Training or when you're already working. And how long is that letter?
It's a book. It's about this. That's all we ask of you. The letter shouldn't really, ideally, be more than a page and a half. That's why it's difficult. It's very easy to write 6 pages. But one and a half pages is harder to do. And of course, in the book, we give an example of how you started. So what has happened is that, of course, hundreds of patients have got the same paragraph at the beginning. So here we are saying it's very personal, but everyone copies the letter that, of course, we put in the book. So the first paragraph is the same everywhere. Now, in terms of supervision, when you're training, you see 2 cases, and they're supervised weekly, each one weekly, and you tape your sessions, and some tapes are randomly selected by your supervisor so that they can rate how on model or not you are. And once you're qualified, that's entirely, it's a personal decision what you do. Yeah. But it's 2 patients weekly, each in supervision. Because remember that certainly in the UK, as things stand, you can't do the DIT training unless you're already a psychodynamic counselor or therapist. So we're assuming a lot of prior experience. It is just about the application to a brief model of all that prior knowledge and experience. It was a sort of tiger that was embraced with a bird. It's a very unusual tattoo. And we spent a lot of time thinking about whether he was the tiger or the bird or both. We had a lot of discussions in the middle phase were around the tattoo. Now, I should say that obviously I have a particular interest in tattoos, and the lecture that we're going to have later in the week about body modification, this is my area of interest, though I am not tattooed. myself. Not because I think it's a bad thing, it's just I'm too frightened. So I had a particular interest in it, which someone else might not have been looking at that, but you could have found another entry point somatically because he was so tense that I think one could have approached it in different ways. But clearly the tattoo was significant because it was his badge of belonging to a homosexual community as he saw it in his mind. And that's why it was the beginnings of him differentiating himself from the projections from his family in terms of expectations. So, by the time we finished the therapy, his shirt still covered it. He came back 18 months later, having moved away from home, where he had been living up until then, and was now in a homosexual relationship in another part of England, and asking me if I could refer him to another therapist, because he recognized that he struggled a great deal with this critical part of him, and his boyfriend said it was driving him mad because he could never do anything that was just right. So it's a good illustration of how DIT, of course, couldn't change that, but it made him aware of a pattern that he could recognize he could completely spoil something good. But when he came back 18 months later, he was wearing a T-shirt and the tattoo was fully visible. The other significant change was that, you remember I described him as being very hunched. He looked taller. So the stature of the brother, and actually he wasn't that tall, but he became taller. So I thought at that point, if nothing else, DIT could be sold as a kind of therapy that gives you an extra few inches, even if it doesn't cure your depression. So.
After you finish, can a patient come back?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think if they came back and wanted a long-term therapy, I think that might be difficult because certainly I know that although I'm quite active anyway, I'm not as active as an analyst as I am as a DIT therapist. So I think it would be a rather unusual experience. So my personal choice is to refer on to someone different, that I've done a very distinct piece of work and now this is something else. But I wouldn't say that's a hard and fast rule. That's just how I feel about it.
I was wondering, how do you approach patients that have depression caused by the loss of someone they love, like your patient, for example, and if it's possible to approach this kind of patients with it?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think with any kind of loss, you probably wouldn't be offering therapy in the first year because it'd be very natural to have all sorts of feelings if you lost someone significant. So you would only be seeing them if they were actually clinically depressed at that point, and the loss might have been the trigger for that. But of course, loss triggers the activation of all sorts of internal templates to do with attachment figures and their availability or unavailability. So there would be no reason why you wouldn't offer it in that sort of situation at all. So I think, yeah. It just occurs to me, because your question about could you use it with this, I didn't say anything about the adaptation of the new model, the new version. Shall I say something about that in the last 5 minutes? Okay, so we've only done a small pilot study, and one of my colleagues is writing up the paper, so there's nothing out there yet on it. But essentially, the pilot study was carried out in a complex care service, so it's a specialist service within the public health sector, which is aimed at patients who, by definition, have got a range of complex needs, many of whom have got personality disorders as well as PTSD or depression and so on. So DIT is still being offered for the treatment of depression, but in the context of a much more complicated clinical presentation. So there what we've done is that we've extended the model to 26 sessions. The first 20 sessions are weekly, and then we cut down to fortnightly for the last 6 sessions. So when you take into account breaks and the fact that it goes down to weekly, the therapy spans almost a year. So although it's not every week, you have contact with the patient for almost a year. So that already feels a little bit different from the patient's point of view. The adaptations are primarily that the initial phase is longer. So you have 6 or 7 sessions really to engage the patient. So you're not expected to give the IPAF until a bit later on than relative to the original model. You use mentalizing techniques much more freely because these patients, as I said earlier, by definition, have more deficits in this domain. The letter is only given at session 20, so it's before you go down to the fortnightly meetings. And one of the things that we do much more work on are what we call in this adaptation RIBS, repetitive relationship interference behaviors. So we're looking at particularly getting the patient to really focus in on what it is that they do in their relationships that keeps kind of creating these difficulties. And there's much more focus on defenses because we have a bit more time in the therapy to do that with the patients. So we'll see what emerges out of this. The other thing that will be coming out shortly, we hope, Peter has asked me not to discuss the results in public because they're still under peer review, but we have completed the first randomized control trial of the 16-session DIT model, which looked at DIT compared to treatment as usual, which was fortnightly phone calls from a nurse. So this is all in public health service settings. And then we did, within this study, a pilot study of DIT versus CBT. And, I haven't emigrated, so clearly the results are not as that bad, but it wasn't, we had, I can't remember, 120 patients. It wasn't a massive study, but I think it's probably enough, we hope, to fund much larger scale studies. But in all honesty, our interest really now is more about seeing what DIT can offer as added value for patients who haven't been able to make use of CBT. So we are trying to really refine why refer someone for DIT. If they've had CBT and it hasn't worked, would these patients do better in DIT as opposed to more CBT, which is probably what they would be getting. So we're just trying to kind of be a bit more specific, but we're obviously waiting for the peer reviews to come back, and I hope that sometime later this year the study will be published. Yes. We had a small group that I supervised who were interested in this, and unfortunately, because there are so many things to do, that slipped off our radar. But in a nutshell, what they found is that the model worked fine as it is with adolescents. The one thing that didn't work so well was the letter, which was very interesting. They didn't engage with it, so we weren't sure whether if as an adolescent, you're in a period of your life where people are writing reports about you all the time, whether this feels like yet another bloody report that someone's evaluating me, or whether letters these days are so passé and old-fashioned that actually we need to kind of do something with new technologies that will engage them. We didn't go much further because it's sort of kind of, as I say, unfortunately we dropped that. But that's where we got to. The rest was fine. The other thing is that obviously this was with adolescents who were 16 years and above, so that according to the way the UK operates, you don't have to involve parents if they're competent over 16. With under 16s, we had envisaged that we would build into the first 4 sessions a session where the parents would be invited in to understand a bit how the therapy worked, and so that they could support the therapy, because as we know, with young people who are still very dependent on parents, if they're not co-opted into the process, the therapy very often sort of dwindles and doesn't continue. But we were only actually seeing 16 and above.
It will be part of the new manual.
Sorry?
It will be part of the new manual.
The adolescent bit?
Yeah.
Well, we're not writing a new manual. What we've done for the pilot studies that we've adapted, we've got a manual that isn't published yet. If any of you are interested in doing research, we can certainly share it, but with the proviso that we've only done a small pilot study which hasn't even been published yet, so that would be, but I'm very happy to share that. And it just shows you the adaptations that we've done to it, so, but nothing is published as such.
What do you think about, I know that it was created for depressive patient, but what do you think to use this in patient woman has battered woman.
Battered.
Battered. Yes, gender violence.
Mhm.
Woman who has received violence from the
Yes.
department. So, this is one question. And the other is this is a more research question. What do you think is the best way to assess, evaluate the to approach the CCRT with the blood system? Or what do you think is the best way to capture the impact and to see the changes in the impact through the process?
Okay, the first question in terms of the battered woman was whether DID could be applied to victims of domestic violence. I guess that you can take any approach and apply it to all sorts of things. I sometimes feel slightly anxious about, when you have a new approach available, everyone gets very excited and starts to apply it, and we haven't looked at that particular application, so I'd be just a bit concerned about saying, yes, do it. I mean, there's no reason why you can't use the way of formulating in DID. Whether you then work in exactly the same way, I don't know. You have to take into account the specifics of those kinds of issues, but that could be an interesting study to do, for example. So there's nothing that would say, don't do it. The question is, what are you treating? Okay.
Or social.
Well, exactly. So that's you have to define that very clearly, I think. I think that would be the thing. I mean, for example, we adapted a little bit, DIT for use with war veterans in New York at the Manhattan Veterans Hospital. So, of course, many of the patients there have also got diagnosis of PTSD. And one of the very important the model was to understand the very particular relationship that veterans have to the institution. Because these are people who've given up their lives for their country. It's the only publicly health-funded service in the US, as you probably know. But so much of their time in the therapy was taken up with the anger that these individuals understandably feel about having fought for their country and then being treated very badly. So you have to kind of understand the context, and it may be that domestic violence calls for very specific understanding and attunements to some of these issues. In terms of the other question, in all honesty, I'm probably not the best person to ask this question because I'm not a researcher in that sense. I write manuals. That's what I do. And then I get other people to do the research. Peter Fonagy is the person to ask, or Patrick Luyten, who also is doing a lot of research. They're the ones who know about the instruments. I'm being completely honest about it. That's not my forte, to understand what would be the right instrument. It's people such as yourselves who actually do that wonderful work. No, we haven't. In the studies that we're doing, we're not studying the IPAF specifically. We're looking just at outcomes of the therapy. So, of course, there's a lot of work to be done to that. Does the IPAF make any difference? Does the letter make any difference? Like any of these therapies that draw on a range of interventions, we don't yet know what are the really sort of curative factors.
Any other question?
Yeah.
Yes, here we are. The last one.
To a poem. I mean, I think with adolescents we haven't got it right, and it may be that it has to be much more explicitly collaborative. Maybe you do something that is more plastic, yes, or using the technology, you draw something. I mean, I think it just didn't work. I mean, I could just tell this was just did not have the same impact. So, again, another interesting thing to develop and think about. Yeah.
Well, we have to finish. We are 5 minutes past 1. Thank you very much for coming. Tomorrow night we'll have the other conference at the Peruvian Psychoanalytic Society. And for the programs, we will meet here Thursday morning, 9 a.m. for the doctorate students and 11
for the master students, for listen the supervision of one of our students here. Well, thank you very much, and see you in the next activities. Thank you, Alessandra.